Welcome to the Angel Health Podcast. Today, I'm super excited to have Dr. Frances Verter with us today. She is the founder of Parents Guide to Cord Blood and the co-founder of Cell Trials. So I feel like you're like the brain trust of the cord blood banking industry, which is really cool. So yeah, I'm really, really honored that you're here today and able to chat about cord blood banking and your experiences with it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor for a person like me who's a boomer to actually be interviewed for a Gen Z podcast.
Of course. Awesome. Well, yeah, I'd love to know a little bit more about your background, looking at your LinkedIn and such. I know you had a background at NASA. And so, yeah, I'm really curious how you pivoted into the cord blood banking space and also recently co-founded Cell Trials.
Well, I backed into this career accidentally, as many people do. I think the trick is, to just recognize that something's working, once you started accidentally. But growing up, well, as a child, I knew I was different. I was smarter than most kids. I skipped a couple grades in school. As a teenager, I decided I wanted to be a scientist, actually an astronomer. And I was very fortunate that my parents supported me to be whatever I wanted to be, which is unusual because I was a teenager in the 1970s. And my parents did have some conventional expectations. They just sort of assumed I'd get married at a young age and live nearby, and they were shocked when I didn't do that. But they let me pursue any career. And I went into physics at a time when it was 90% male, so it was an uphill battle. I constantly had to prove that I wasn't getting in on a quota, or as part of some
Yeah.
sort of kind of program to bring in a few representative women. And I was making it as a physicist. I was winning grant money, I was doing research, and I was writing papers. But then my first child had cancer, and that derailed my career because I spent a great deal of time in the hospital with her. And despite everything we did, she ended up passing away. And at that point, I needed to find a different job because I hadn't been publishing papers, so I couldn't get a grant. And I switched careers. I actually had a second career, which most people aren't aware of, that I spent about 9 years as a computer programmer. This is also at NASA. So at first I was at NASA as an astronomer, then I was at NASA doing programming. And this was the time when I founded the Parents Guide, because you asked me, what is the origin story? That'll be
Yeah.
question two that we'll queue up. So I started the website around the time I was doing websites for NASA, and I was preparing data for climate models. And then I ended up in my third career as the cord blood maven. Here I am. I'm trying to retire in this and not do a fourth career.
That's awesome. Do you mind if I ask what kind of cancer your daughter had?
Yeah, so she had a rare cancer. Well, all childhood cancer is rare, but most children who get cancer get leukemia. And the cure rate of that is now like 85 to 90%. I mean, the typical childhood leukemia has a high cure rate. But my kid had a solid tumor, which is called rhabdomyosarcoma. And many people have not even heard of it. And the cure rate on solid tumors is still much lower. She went through a year and a half of treatment. It was very intense. It was chemo every 3 weeks. There was radiation treatment. There was surgery. It was really, like going through the bowels of hell, and a lot of kids, you're on the floor in the hospital a lot, and kids on either side of you are dying, and you're wondering when it's going to hit you next. And she actually recovered from that and went through a period where she was healthy and going to preschool, and we thought we had beat it. And then she developed leukemia, which had been triggered by all that chemotherapy. And she actually went through a stem cell transplant for the leukemia. She relapsed after the transplant. So it was several years of medical hell and doing everything and losing no matter what we did.
Thank you for sharing. My next question is, what is the origin story of Parents Guide to Cord Blood? So I'm curious if it was related to your daughter.
It was really indirectly related. So, one day I was on the floor at the hospital. There was a couple in the room next door to me that happened to be a biracial couple, and they had a kid with leukemia who was in the hospital for his initial induction chemo, and the mom was really pregnant. And they were standing outside the door to their room, and I was leaving my room, and the oncologist walked up to them and said, I have to talk to you about banking the cord blood of the baby you're about to have because we can use it for your kid. And I overheard that. And so, of course, I, looked it up and I made the decision that, in the future, I wanted to do that. This really connects to your personal story because you have talked about how your family is multiracial. And that was
Yeah.
exactly why the doctor approached that family and said, look, if your kid needs a transplant later, it would be great if we bank cord blood from the baby you're about to have. So it's classic, parallel situation that people of mixed race having a hard time finding a donor. So after Shy, my first child, died, I became pregnant again. And when I was pregnant with my second child, I did research cord blood banking. I wanted to like privately own it. And I looked into all the private banks that were available. Now, this is 1998, so it was a short list. But I discovered that just like today, their websites had all these vague feel-good statements. And I was thinking to myself, what are they really doing in the lab? So I, made up a list of questions and I called all the banks and I interviewed them. And if the person on the phone didn't know what they were talking about, I made them transfer me to someone who did. And I had this whole spreadsheet of information because I'm really anal with information. And then I thought, oh, gee, this could be a public service. Let me put this online so that somebody else doesn't have to do the same thing. And boom, the Parents Guide was born.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I love that. Because I mean, even though Parents Guide to Cord Blood exists today, we still get parents that will have like hour-long phone calls with us with questions. So yeah, I think that's a common experience that parents share.
And that's good because they should.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious how you've seen the cord blood banking industry evolve. You mentioned you started in 1998. I'm probably the age of your second child because I was born in
26?
1998. Yeah, I'm 26. I'm about to turn 26 in a few weeks.
Oh my gosh, she's 26 already and she's getting married next month.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Ask
Awesome.
me why I look haggard. It's because I have a wedding coming up. Actually, what I have seen as a big change is that stem cells aren't like a hot topic now the way they were back then.
Hmm.
So, like in the late 90s and the early 2000s, stem cells were like the hot topic in medicine, and magazine articles were being written about them all the time. It was just a lot of buzz. Really generated a lot of positive press and helped cord blood banking to take off. And I feel that nowadays it's people are more skeptical. Oh, why should I bother to do it? Because it's
Hmm.
not perceived as cutting edge medicine, but it is still valuable. It still gives families more medical options. I think that it takes a little bit more effort now to get that educational message across.
That's interesting. Was there a study in particular that you think created stem cell buzz?
A lot of parents were excited about the really early trials, like in the mid 2000s is when Dr. Kurtzberg at Duke University started using cord blood for cerebral palsy and other forms of brain injury. And it led to a lot of excitement that this was soon going to be approved. And it's been through a series of clinical trials, but 20 years later, it's still not approved. And that is a source of frustration for everybody that to get approval from the FDA moves very slowly. In other countries, these therapies are more accessible because the
Yeah,
medical system is not as strict.
I see. Interesting. Okay, so I guess in general, why do you think parents should consider banking cord blood, or do you think they should at all?
Would I be running the Parents Guide to Cord Blood if I didn't think they should bank? Yes, of course. I think parents should bank. And the main reason is because it's a one-time opportunity to harvest the stem cells in the cord blood, which are, first of all, one of the richest sources of blood in the human body. They're pristine because they're from the time of birth. They haven't been exposed to various chemicals and viruses that the kid will get later. And they're a match to the child, and they're a partial match to siblings. So they have the potential for any therapy that requires the types of stem cells that you can find in cord blood, which is actually, there's a variety of different cells in there. And any therapy that calls for that, you can use that if you have it already in your family, if you need a partial match. So I think it's valuable. And, you were going to ask me later, how would you tell parents to deal with all this information in the middle of birth? Well, in the middle of getting ready for birth, not when you're in labor,
Yeah,
but parents have a lot of things they have to deal with. You have to decide what car seat to buy. That's a hard decision. And, you
mm,
have to, consult consumer websites and read ratings and read parent reviews. And, you're preparing just in case you're in a car accident and you need that car seat. And, I
yeah.
think parents should look at cord blood banking the same way, just in case, be prepared and do the
Okay.
research.
It's interesting because although I think there are various experts in the cord blood field that have this opinion, there's still so many parents that don't even know about cord blood banking. Like on our social media, we get a lot of comments along the lines of, I gave birth 4 days ago and nobody told me about this. So why do you think there are professionals in the space that hold the opinions that you do that pregnant parents should bank cord blood, but there's still a gap in knowledge?
So I was going to give you the funny answer. There's a gap in knowledge because there are not enough parents reading my website.
That's a good answer.
That would fix the problem. But there are a bunch of social factors. Why are parents not finding my website or not reading my website? And I think there are social factors involved. Does their pediatrician or obstetrician mention cord blood banking to them and give them a pamphlet or suggest they get informed? Have their friends done it? What do
Yeah.
they consider to be information sources? So in the early days, when this industry started, again, parents were very, very excited about stem cells. I was getting really detailed questions. Parents wanted to know exactly how does the processing work? And how does the freezing work? For whatever reason, people have shorter attention spans now. A lot of parents have started to think of cord blood banking as a commodity, that you either do it or you don't do it, but it's the same no matter where you do it. And
Hmm.
this drives me nuts because it's not the same no matter where you do it. Some banks really are better than other banks. They're using better laboratories, they're using better shipping kits, they have an accreditation. And I keep trying to get the message across to research the bank. It's not just a matter of what's cheap, pick a good bank.
Yeah.
And that's a big education challenge. And then there's also, Dan, this is a cultural thing, but there have been psychological studies that Gen Z does not trust authority figures. I do find, possibly because I'm an older person and I'm not like an expectant mom age range anymore, maybe I don't look like a peer. I find that people are more likely to talk to their peers than consult, a nonprofit foundation expert resource, which is where they should be getting their answers. But you have these discussion forums where you have a group of people and nobody knows what they're talking about, but they're all trying to get answers from each other instead of looking up, an expert answer. And it drives me nuts.
Well, on the contrary, I think the assumption is Gen Z doesn't respect like capitalist figures because we tend to lean very liberal. So I would think that most folks would be inclined to trust a nonprofit. One thing that I thought was interesting was I've actually previously tried to submit to a science-based parenting forum a couple of your pieces, and they mentioned that they didn't want to because there was solicitation for donation from cord blood banking companies. And so that was interesting.
Wait, there was that I was soliciting donations to support the foundation, or because banks were soliciting parents to donate their cord blood?
Because you had a PayPal link on your site, basically, and then like ads for other
Really?
banks. So people were, yeah, so I got some feedback that they just weren't sure if it could necessarily be an unbiased resource. So yeah, I know this is kind of a question for later, but
That's
yeah,
really, yeah. I mean, how do you expect me to keep this going?
yeah, I
It's a
agree. I
nonprofit
agree.
foundation and we need to get
Yeah.
donations.
Yeah. And I think
And
cord blood banks are the most likely donors.
I mean, most of the donors are cord blood banks and also vendors to the space because they want to see the cord blood banks do well, but also accreditation agencies, registries like Be the Match, which just
Right.
rebranded as an MDP. And yeah, I mean, I can't live on thin air.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, I disputed their comment around that. So I'll get back to you. I know we chatted about how companies in the space have changed over time and I've seen the industry evolve, but how have you seen physicians' involvement in the cord blood space change over time? I'm curious, especially when it comes to OBGYNs and also physicians who might administer stem cell treatments.
There's been a big change. It used to be that obstetricians were pretty much in bed with cord blood banks. I mean, there were certain obstetricians who sent all of their clients to one particular bank that they worked with. And I even tried, having some polite conversations with them about why do you send all of your clients to this one bank? There are other banks out there. Don't you think that's like an improper steering? And they would say, oh, but the thing is, I've researched this bank. I know it's okay. I haven't researched the others and I don't want to bother, so I'm sending everybody to this one. But if you go back to like the late 2000s, if you were pregnant and you went to your obstetrician's office, when you went into the exam room, it would just be full of gifts from cord blood banks. They'd have a calendar from a bank. They'd have one of those little wheels to figure out when is your due date. They'd have pens, I mean, measuring tape for how big is your belly, all of these things branded by cord blood banks. And also, the banks would hold weekend retreats at resorts where they would do
Oh, wow.
continuing medical education for the doctors, all about stem cells and therapies with cord blood. I mean, I know about this because I used to speak at these. This stuff has not totally crashed, but those retreats don't take place anymore. There's been a big push in the medical communities that doctors should not be so in bed with pharma companies, not
Right.
just cord blood banks, but doctors in general. In the obstetrics field, they have a professional society, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, ACOG. They have issued an opinion, that doctors should really restrict, relationships and gifts and things like that. So they remind me actually of federal employees because I worked at NASA for a long time and you couldn't accept a meal that was more than $25 from like a contractor to the government. And doctors have become closer to that. So the particular practice that I go to, I'm still going to the same OB-GYN practice that I've been going to for decades since I had my kids. When I go into that exam room now, there is not a single ad from a cord blood bank or any other company. I mean, it's completely clean. It's actually kind of boring because I used to go into these rooms and do a lot of competitor research. Who are they
Right.
working with and what have they got?
Right.
But now they have a policy that they're not taking advertising from any company. So the good news is that doctors are not funneling all their patients to one particular bank as much. I'm sure it still happens in some places. But the bad news is I think that doctors don't talk to moms about cord blood banking as much either. And that's the downside is I think they really should say, have you considered cord blood banking? We have an education pamphlet in our collection of materials for new moms, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm curious what kind of misconceptions you've seen around cord blood banking because I think I've seen similar response amongst OBs, especially younger OBs. I think they feel less inclined to sponsor any specific company, even outside of cord blood banking. Like they don't want to push any specific prenatal or anything like that. So yeah, I think it leaves more room for misconceptions because people kind of don't really know where to turn for their resources. So yeah, I'm curious what kind of misconceptions are most common amongst pregnant parents about cord blood banking.
I think the biggest one is that they feel it's only useful for very young children because they've heard about applications. That's what they hear about the most. They hear about cerebral palsy. They hear that, oh, you may only have enough cord blood to transplant a child. And so they have a tendency to assume that once their kid grows and gets bigger, that they should just throw it out and it's not useful for anything. So I frequently hear from parents who are like, should I keep it another year? Should I get rid of it? And I have to like talk them off the ledge on a regular basis. There are uses for cord blood that do not require a big unit. I mean, first of all, transplants are really rare. Very few kids have a condition where they require a transplant. And I think parents should be thinking more in terms of regenerative medicine when they decide to bank. Kid gets older, there's more things that could happen.
How do you define regenerative medicine versus the other use cases that are traditional?
So using cord blood for cerebral palsy is actually regenerative medicine. There's a lot of clinical trials right now that are using stem cells to treat autoimmune diseases, which become more common as you get older. There are trials using cord blood for multiple sclerosis. There are trials using CAR T cells for lupus that have been really, really successful, and people are considering it to be a groundbreaking treatment for lupus. And there are T cells in cord blood, so there is a connection there. Also, there are products, for example, in South Korea, there is a company that uses cord blood to manufacture an orthopedic treatment that they inject into knees. For example, if you tear your meniscus, you can get this injection, and it is approved by their FDA. So it's being used a lot. They have a lot of sales. So there are things that could be done that aren't being done in this country yet, but there are definitely, more applications. As a person gets older, more likely to have an injury and more likely to have an autoimmune problem, stuff like that
Yeah.
can happen.
Earlier, you mentioned that you feel like there are definite differentiations between different labs, and there are certain labs that are better than others. I know you're relatively in touch with our lab and know our lab director. So I'm curious what you think about our lab. And we don't necessarily have to put this in.
Well, okay. Well, disclaimer is that I am the head of the scientific and medical advisory panel to your lab. So, of course, I like it.
Yeah.
And I have been on that panel since 2007. So I think that I got what I like to refer to as a combat promotion. I think that the primary reason I became the head of the committee is that I'm the longest serving member. After the previous head retired, they just defaulted to me.
That's cool.
Yeah, so that's a great lab because it's also a public bank, so it follows very high standards. They have a quality accreditation and they also are certified by NMTP. They follow the standards of public banks, which are higher than private banks are required to follow. They have a
Yeah.
shorter timeline on which they have to process a unit. They have to regularly do tests on the retrieval of viable stem cells from units. So it's very high standards.
Okay, great. Good to hear. I'd love to move into specifically your work with Parents Guide to Cord Blood. So I'm curious how you source story ideas, especially because we actually feature a lot of them on our social medias. Like I think you guys have pretty much the best case studies related to cord blood stem cells, and you add in not only the data, but also the real people behind it. Like you have photos and their names and where they're from. And I think that makes it really special and much more readable for the average consumer.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I really have to admit that I have no special method of finding stories or any one particular source. It's like I constantly have my ears and eyes open to anything that strikes me as this would make a good story. And it can be really random. Like I could be at dinner and with some people from a conference and somebody mentions something, I'm thinking, I wonder if I could write that up as a story. And then in order to make sure I don't forget it, I put a note on my phone to myself. I'm always looking for things. But since I go to conferences and I talk to people from all the banks around the world, or most of them, it enables me to find, testimonial stories about their patients. Like, for example, the kids from Romania that were on Romanian TV, I found out about that and I got some video clips and I got it translated and you featured it.
Yeah.
And whenever I see a patient story, really people respond the best. I find both professionals and parents want to see patient stories.
Yeah.
So I try to find those.
Interesting. So is it normally that you're able to speak with the patients themselves? Because you usually have pretty intimate information about who they are and even photos.
Well, I usually rely on the bank to do that because there are privacy issues
Yeah.
and I don't know what they are from one country to another. So I rely on the bank to approach the patient, ask for their permission and do the video. And then I will be working from, like, the bank will have sent me, usually the person I'm corresponding with will have sent me some information in an email, like what their names are, and they will give me a video, which may be in their language, and either they have added subscripts or they have sent me a transcript. I think the key thing is that because I know somebody like a marketing director or a CEO at the bank, I get some companion information to go with that video, and I can use that to put together an article. And I
Yeah.
do try to be careful to only use first names because
Mhm.
in the beginning I used whole names, but I discovered that, the thing is once you put something up on the internet, it kind of stays there forever. And I've been contacted by parents saying that their kid is older now and they don't want like their kid's friends to know that their kid had this treatment when they were
Right.
younger. Now, this is very ironic, but with some kids who do really, really well, like maybe the kid had a limp from cerebral palsy, but it goes away and they've got a fairly normal gait, or perhaps the kid is on the autism spectrum, but now they have much better communication skills. Sometimes when a kid is doing really well, the parents try to have their kid mainstreamed at school and they want the kid to pass for normal. So they do not want the testimonial out there with their full name. It's kind of ironic that in a big success story, you sometimes, don't get permission to put everything out there. There are some parents that
Yeah.
don't even want to do it.
Yeah, I guess I relate to that somewhat because my younger brother had cerebral palsy my whole life, and I didn't normally like to talk about it when I was in high school and younger because I didn't want people to feel bad for me. And then I actually created a nonprofit in high school called California Cerebral Palsy Care, and I would do fundraising efforts and donated to cerebral palsy research initiatives. So then I started talking about it more, but it felt really difficult for me to even do that because I didn't want people to give me pity.
Yeah, it is ironic. Yeah, sometimes it's just hard for people to talk about the thing that they need to like to get the message out.
Well, I know we touched upon this a little bit earlier, but can you talk about the importance of presenting unbiased and scientifically backed information to parents, and how do you ensure that you are able to maintain an impartial guide, because I feel like that's kind of one of your missions. It seems to provide a truly impartial resource.
It is very hard. And I think people who don't know what I deal with day to day have no idea how hard it is. But routinely, when you get information from banks, they very often exaggerate about themselves. And I've had banks say, oh, we follow the such and such standard, but they're not actually accredited by the standard. They're just claiming to follow it. So I have to do fact checking. I mean, there's some things I can't really fact check. Like if they tell me our inventory is so many units, I can't, sneak into their lab at night and count their units. But, to the extent that I can cross-check the information, I try to, take out the hyperbole and present the accurate information. Sometimes banks are not happy with me because I make them do that. And it's the constant tension because I'm trying to get donations from banks to support this educational mission. But then they're annoyed with me because I wouldn't let them say something that's not true. So I'm constantly in the middle there. It's like I'm struggling to be Switzerland, and it's hard.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure parents are grateful for it. We've had a few parents come in through your site that found us there. So grateful for your resource. Since you try to find especially evidence-based information, I'm curious who you admire in the cord blood stem cell space, research-wise or otherwise.
When you gave me that as an advanced question, I thought about it and I didn't want to say the same thing as everybody else. In the end, that I do have to say the same thing as everybody else is that the person I admire is Dr. Joanne Kurtzberg,
Uh-huh.
who is really, personally the most important force in this entire field, because she was the person who tried using cord blood for metabolic disorders as a stem cell transplant for like leukodystrophies. And then she noticed that the kids' IQs improved. And so she decided on the basis of that to try using cord blood for cerebral palsy and then later for autism. So she's a medical pioneer, but I also find it's just impressive the way she runs her program. There's this entire department of stem cell therapy at Duke that she has built over more than 40 years, like from the ground up. Like I could literally say from the ground up because I toured their building and they have a cord blood bank in the basement. And she can walk you through the bank. And even though she's not responsible for the day-to-day activities of the bank, she knows what every single machine does and what's in this cabinet. And this is what we do next. And she knows everything because she founded that bank. Then you go up to the top floor of the building where they have her department and they have clean rooms and they have offices, and she knows what everybody is doing. She knows the basis of all the research programs and the progress and whether or not it's going to be commercially viable if they try to hand it off to a pharma company. And it's like, she is a force of nature. She really is.
That's so awesome. Yeah, I met her briefly at Cord Blood Connect a few years ago. And yeah, she's such a sweet woman. And I'm so tall, so she's a little bit shorter than I am. So yeah, that was kind of funny. But yeah, I totally agree.
People think that she's sweet, but in order to get things done, you have to be tough when you're a woman in
Right.
science.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious, what are the most impactful use cases of cord blood banking that you think pregnant parents should know about, especially since you've written so many?
Well, what I think is the most important, like right now, is cerebral palsy, because there's been a statistical study published that looked back at all the previous cerebral palsy clinical trials and found that if you combine the data into a meta-analysis, that there's statistical significance that you can show that cord blood helps cerebral palsy. And at Duke, they are trying to launch a phase 3 trial. They're having some funding issues, but if this trial meets its endpoints, then the FDA will approve cord blood for cerebral palsy. I mean, that's an
Oh,
if, and it's a few years down the road, but
yeah.
I feel that the industry could be at the cusp of a sea change if we get something approved. It's like getting a ball through the goalpost in a sports game.
For sure. Are there any case studies in particular that emotionally resonate with you?
Like patient stories.
Yeah.
There was a family that I interviewed about a decade ago, and then I interviewed them again this summer. So this is a boy named Mason who lives in the Philadelphia area, and he was born with this really rare metabolic condition called osteopetrosis, where your body makes too many bones. I mean, your bones are too
Wow.
thick. If you have the severe form of this, it actually kills you. You don't live very long. And he had a cord blood transplant when he was still an infant, and he has managed to lead a mostly normal life. I had originally, talked to his parents because his mom was involved in collecting cord blood donations for a public bank, and she was doing a nonprofit, and she was all caught up in patient advocacy around this disease. And I came back a decade later, and it's kind of interesting. She said she had stopped doing the patient advocacy because her son, who had been the patient, was not really into it because he just wanted to be a regular teenager. And she said, I came to realize it was more for me to talk to the other parents than it was for him.
Yeah.
So she let that go. And her son is doing great in school, honor student, okay. But the amazing thing is that here's a kid who had abnormal bones. He's playing all kinds of sports. I mean, it was mind-boggling. He had been competitively swimming for years. He played on his high school football team. I'm like, oh my God. It was, kind of mind-boggling how healthy he is considering, that he had this disease where he wasn't even supposed to live to this age.
Yeah, that's
So that
awesome.
story really inspires me.
Was it solely related to cord blood that treated him, or was he?
Yeah, he did have to go through some surgeries to correct some places where he had a bone overgrowth. He actually had to have some bone removed. It was just, like kind of amazing to me.
That's awesome. Was it his own cord blood?
No, it was from a donor because he was born with a metabolic disorder.
Okay, I see. Interesting. So I know you've touched upon some patient stories, but are there any potential research advancements in the umbilical cord or even placenta stem cell space that you find really promising?
I had mentioned a while back that there's multiple different types of stem cells in cord blood, and there are researchers who were producing anti-cancer products using like one particular cell type that they get from cord blood. There's multiple things going on. For example, there's something called the natural killer cell, and there are several companies that are culturing them from cord blood and then putting them in clinical trials to help cancer patients. There are things called regulatory T cells. Probably everybody's heard of CAR T cells. So there's a variety of cellular therapies that are being made from cord blood. And actually, currently, if you look at like the past 5 years of clinical trials that are focused on hematology oncology, 86% are pursuing those novel therapies.
Oh, wow.
So
Interesting.
it's really dominating the research with cord blood right now in terms of hematology, oncology
Yeah.
applications. There's also, in terms of both cord blood and birth tissues, I see a lot of birth tissue research for infertility. I see birth tissue cells being used to increase the thickness of the uterus in women who are having difficulty getting eggs to implant.
Cord tissue stem cells to treat
Yes,
infertility.
or placenta cells. And
Interesting.
and I have seen clinical trials doing that. There's orthopedic applications, because you can get mesenchymal stem cells from cord tissue, birth tissue. Those are being used, for knees and other joints. So there's a lot of research going on right now. I mean, it's an active field. Parents should still be enthusiastic that there are more uses, coming in the future. The thing I always say to parents, whether they're considering banking or they have banked and they're thinking of throwing it out, it's like, oh, why should we continue keeping it? I always say it is better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it.
Yeah, definitely.
That's sort of like my mother and grandmother opinion on it.
Yeah, that's great. I know you've mentioned some use cases and research in other countries outside of the US. So I'm curious how you've seen cord blood evolve internationally. And especially, I think one article that I frequently refer to in Parents Guide to Cord Blood is the different percentages of parents that are banking. And I think it's really interesting that, for instance, in China and Singapore, it's as high as 30% of parents banking. And in Portugal, it's randomly 10%, but in other countries in the EU, it's like less than 1%. In the US, it's only 2%. So, yeah, what do you think causes that differentiation? And what is your kind of perspective on evolving cord blood internationally?
Well, because we have this directory of banks around the world, I do, look at what's going on, and it's almost like a layer cake. I mean, it depends on what are the medical regulations on biobanking that company, and also what are the medical regulations on using cells from a biobank, the economy of the country, actually the extent to which parents have health insurance, and just cultural differences. Like in Singapore, the penetration, there's a significant, like 20 to 30% of the birth market is banking cord blood, and
Yeah.
it's partly because the birth rate in Singapore is lower and they give parents a baby bonus to encourage them to have a baby. Parents are spending that baby bonus on cord blood banking. So it's actually, I think, the baby bonus that drives. In a lot of Asian countries, it's a lot easier to go to a clinic and get cell therapy for whatever ails you, than it is in the US. I think that in China there is an attitude that using stem cells is a bit like traditional medicine. It's something that people can avail themselves of if they want to go to a clinic. I have heard that some Chinese moms are using their child's cord blood for anti-aging treatments for themselves. Now, that's not, like the rule, but it does go on. Some people doing it, and that's not allowed in this country at all. But there's a lot of clinics and a lot of stem cell tourism to countries like Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea. And
Yeah.
so there's just way more applications possible there. And then there's also cultural differences. I find India to be a very interesting situation because they currently have the world's highest birth rate. Well, they're the world's biggest country. They passed China and became the biggest. And the whole cultural situation around birth is different from the US because a young married couple usually lives with the groom's parents. So they live in extended family units. And when the wife becomes pregnant, and the family is considering cord blood banking, the bank sends a sales rep to their house. So it's not like they just look at a website and make a decision and click a button. More like purchasing life insurance, where the sales rep comes to your house, makes a presentation to the entire family. And it is very often the grandparents who make the decision whether or not we're doing this because they're going to pay for it. So it's a family decision, and that's why the presentation has to be made to the entire family. And it's just different from the culture here.
Interesting. I actually didn't know that about India, but it's still an out-of-pocket cost in India and they don't receive a stipend.
Yes. No,
Interesting.
there's no because there's no baby bonus in India. Yeah, so it is only the more educated people in cities who can afford it.
Okay, awesome. Well, I know one big objection for parents and why I imagine it's only 2% in the US is because of the financial barrier to it. Like it's traditionally seen as very expensive. And even with us, like offering payment plans, we're able to resonate with a lower income community. But of course, I think the best healthcare is free. So I'm curious to get your take on like, is cord blood banking worth the cost? And what do you think might need to happen to lower the cost?
A lot of banks in the US are focused on affordability right now. So in the early days of this market, the business model was that the bank would charge a pretty high initial fee to process the cord blood, which would enable them to break even on the processing. Over the years afterwards, there would be a storage fee, which is where they would eventually make a profit. But starting around 2021, a lot of banks in the US drastically dropped their initial fee. So now the business model is to spread like the cost out over several years, possibly with monthly payments. I mean, it really makes the affordability much better for parents. It's actually hard for banks to survive because they don't break even in the first year. They have to keep that customer, routinely paying longer to break even. And it also creates a barrier. It is hard for a small company, to get into the market, unless they are partnered with a big lab or with a bigger company that they're marketing for. So it's a bit more challenging as a business at the same time
Yeah.
that we're trying to make it more approachable for parents.
So do you think cord blood banking is worth the cost?
Of course, I think it's worth the cost, but I don't think it's going to get cheaper.
I think a lot of parents are curious why it is even so expensive. I'm curious to get your take on why does cord blood banking even cost anything?
Well, because as you know, it goes to a laboratory where you're running clean rooms and you have trained technicians who handle it and process it on very expensive machines to separate the
Yeah,
stem cells and put it into a controlled rate freezer and run maternal blood tests and run viability tests. And none of this is free. Just the
definitely.
cost of all that laboratory processing it's the processing fee. And
Yeah,
that's why I don't think it will get cheaper. I mean, you cannot apply economy of scale to cord blood banking. You can't process multiple units at once. Each one has to be treated individually. So it really cannot get cheaper.
if pregnant parents are looking for advice, what advice would you give them in general?
Read the Parent's Guide to Cord Blood.
Yes.
Set me up for that.
No, yeah, that's good advice. If parents are unsure about banking cord blood, what do you think they should consider? What would you tell them?
Well, again, I don't want to repeat myself, but I feel it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. I'm repeating myself, but that is for me kind of like the bottom line since it does have medical potential. I mean, I've got cord blood for two kids that I've been saving for 26 and 24 years, and I haven't used it yet, but
Yeah.
I continue to pay those storage fees. I think
Yeah.
it's worth holding on to.
Yeah, definitely. So I know in this year, actually, the New York Times came out with a pretty critical piece around cord blood banking. And I was actually interviewed for it, but they didn't use any of our content. And I introduced them as well to four other physicians, both OBGYNs and folks that have themselves administered stem cell treatments. And neither myself nor any of my sources were used in the article. And I know that you were featured and interviewed in it.
And
So
the only reason I got in is because I said something controversial, because that's what you have to do in order to get quoted.
So I'm curious what you think the role is of journalists on reporting on cord blood banking. I feel like cord blood banking has had both like really positive endorsements in the past, but also this one appeared to be like a bit more negative.
What I feel parents need to know that this story needs to get out is don't trust journalists. Well, the problem is it's like everybody on the internet nowadays is being driven by the desire for clicks. And I find that journalists more and more are focusing on writing exposés of scams. And any story that they get their teeth into, they try to somehow find a way to spin it so that it becomes an exposé of a scam.
Mhm.
And that is what happened with these two people who worked on this New York Times story that interviewed dozens and dozens of people. And I have talked to a lot of people who said, they interviewed me, but they never used what I gave them. They talked to multiple patients who benefited from cord blood. And at the end of all that, they decided to center the entire article around four families that had stored cord blood in private banks. And then when they tried to use it, they discovered the cord blood was contaminated. And they made it sound as if that was the rule rather than the exception. I went out and I looked up the release records of the top three private banks in the US, which are the biggest inventories, and they have released over 1,300 cord blood units that successfully treated a child. So that was 1,300 families that got a benefit from private banking in the US alone. But instead of the 1,300, they focused on the four that had, something really bad happen to them. And that was because they wanted the story to be clickbait. And it's, parents see that and get turned off, especially when they make it sound as if, oh, all of your units are contaminated, nobody's going to use it. It really created a crisis. A lot of cord blood bankers spent a lot of time on the phone and email, responding to upset parents. I'm reaching the point where I'm starting to think that journalists, it's almost like swatting, like they sort of show up and create some big blow up, and then they move up to write an article about something else and leave you to pick up the pieces from their blow up.
I think it was interesting because, yeah, like you said, they highlighted the contamination aspect. But I know of stories too where folks have received notification that their cord blood was contaminated, but they're still able to use it. So could you shed some light on that?
So this really is at the discretion of the treating physician. So it's a bit of a gamble if your unit is contaminated and you choose to save it. Down the line, it depends on what you want to use it for, who is your treating physician. If you're thinking of using it for a transplant, it probably won't get used. Like if the patient is immune compromised, they're probably not gonna, take a unit that has any contamination. But I have seen published papers of successful treatments of kids with contaminated units because it was for a condition where the patient was not severely immune compromised. And so the doctor said, oh, this is really common bacteria. We have an antibiotic that treats that. We'll give the antibiotic together with the unit. And it worked out okay. It can be, now you're making me cough. It can be done.
Yeah, we received less questions about it than I anticipated. I at least had your published kind of rebuttal to it. And it was actually the rebuttal that I was going to post in that evidence-based forum that I mentioned. So yeah, I was glad to have that as a go-to resource.
Oh, there was another story I wanted to tell you, and I forgot what was the question that was the lead-in to this, but Sometimes misinformation turns into like a viral rumor. And this is what happened with well, there was a TikTok rumor in the spring of this year that you can sell your placenta for
Yes.
$50,000.
Yeah, we get a lot of questions about that.
And I mean, I even heard that a public bank, people kept asking at the public bank, can I sell my placenta to you? I mean,
Yes.
it really went viral, and actually it blew up our webpage. What is your placenta
Yeah.
worth? Which was an article from 2019, and the whole thing is misinformation. It's a false story because a parent cannot directly sell their placenta. You can only donate your placenta to a medical supply company, which can receive it with all the proper documentation and keep it in the proper environment. And then it can be converted down the line into products that are eventually worth $50,000. You know, once it's been converted into like wound dressings and little patches that you can put on people who have cornea problems and all of that, it's eventually worth $50,000 worth of
Yeah.
products. But a parent cannot personally sell it. That's selling an organ and it's illegal. So we actually ended up running a second article in the newsletter. Like 2 years later, we ran an article, Can You Sell Your Placenta? In order to explain, no, the answer is no. But, you know, even so, I find that this rumor, it's almost like a weed that keeps coming back. Every so often it takes off and we have another go round of this.
Yeah, I saw it recently on Twitter as well. I think it's sort of along the same vein of what you had hinted at earlier, which is, I think, increasing medical skepticism that when it comes from a medical institution. But I think it's interesting. On this podcast, I've asked various OBs that we've had on if they've ever seen a placenta get sold, and the answer is always no, and that it's just burned. Well, I know you had some questions for me, so yeah, I would love to give you the opportunity to do that.
So my question for you is that when you first launched ANGA, which I want to give you credit, it's the only cord blood bank that's been launched in the US in years. So it really took guts to, you know, come in and launch one. But, you know, initially you were doing this whole, you know, I'm going to provide Gen Z marketing to a Gen Z audience, and you were mainly marketing on TikTok. And I've noticed that you've broadened, you know, the kind of things that you're doing, that you're even talking to me, even though I could be your mother or your grandmother. So what was the philosophy behind, you know, changing your marketing approach?
Yeah, I guess I never really saw it as a change so much as like an expansion because, yeah, I still post on TikTok every day. So I just feel like I wanted to tap into greater sources of media. And I felt like a part of the evolution, like when I first started creating content, TikTok was still pretty like hot and new. And it definitely still is hot, but it's not so new anymore. Most of my even like 30-plus-year-old peers are like on TikTok every single day. And so I think one thing that I noticed as short form content in general was becoming more popularized was that this kind of content where you have like more established like creators, if you will, on like a more established platform was something that was becoming popularized. And I think there's so many stories too that I wanted to share that I can't necessarily share. Like I think even your insight around the New York Times article and the fact that you gave a rebuttal piece on that and that you have like so many like personal touches with a lot of personal stories and patient case studies around cord blood banking was something that I feel like would best come from you versus me.
Right.
Awesome. Really appreciate you being here today. That's all the questions that I have. But if people want to find you, I'd love to give you a chance to plug every social media and email and everything like that so that people can find you.
Are you going to run like a question and answer forum somewhere?
We can. I can do that on our Instagram. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I could try to come in and post answers.
Okay, cool. How can people get in touch with Parents Guide to Cord Blood?
Well, we have a contact form because I hate getting phone calls because when I'm trying to write an article, I need to focus. So I don't like being interrupted. I go through blocks of time where I write, then I go through blocks of time where I answer people. So
Yeah.
I try to structure my time to be more productive. So
Okay.
I prefer to people send me emails.
Okay, cool. And what is the email?
There's a contact form on the website and that will
Okay.
forward to me.
Oh, got it. Okay, perfect. Cool. Well, I will link that in our bio. But yeah, definitely for folks that are listening, Parents Guide to Cord Blood is a really amazing resource. And yeah, I'll link it everywhere that we post this episode. But yeah, I really appreciate you being here today.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome.